Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Matt Nelson, and he is from Wisconsin, or excuse me, lives in Wisconsin, actually from California originally. He is a senior tracker, which is the highest level of designation you can get from Cyber Tracker North America. And he is a track and sign specialist, as well as a trailing specialist. So thank you very much for your time and welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Lee. Happy to be here. Happy to be doing this. And I just want to say that I was perusing your Naturalist Studies website, and I like what I see, and I like the work that I see that you're doing in the world. So I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a long story how it came about, which we don't have time to go into today. But I started out, spent a lot of my time mostly teaching at universities, and honestly, just from learning from people like yourself. And it's a good way for us to start off. I attended one of your workshops last year on trailing. It was just incredible. And today, I think we'll probably mostly talk about track and sign, but you have such a well-rounded skill set that, I wanted to take those skills on, and the university students I deal with, and make sure that that gets passed on to them. And because they need it for their field skills, as biologists, which unfortunately is lacking in a lot of cases today. And a lot of them are going to hopefully continue the journey and end up doing work with people like yourself. So anyway, thanks for that. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up? How'd you get into all this? Because again, I think for people who haven't done this before, as I tell my students, this is a rigorous undertaking, becoming a specialist with Cyber Tracker. It's not something you do overnight. And so everybody has a different path getting there, but curious what yours was like.
Yeah, great. Mine, I suppose, was fairly organic. And I will put a little emphasis on that, the rigorousness of getting a special certificate. We jokingly liken it to a PhD in wildlife tracking, right? There's a lot of depth, a lot of background, a lot of broad knowing there. And for someone to get their special certificate, it's no easy process. It takes dedication and a lot of time.
And I can attest that is a true statement. It really is close to a PhD. I mean, I may not have to do a dissertation per se, but the amount of work that goes into it is just unbelievable. It's funny. I have students, saying they'll complain, they're taking a tracking test or something. This is online, and, there's not a perfect, print that they're looking at, trying to ID. I'm like, well, when you're out in the field, that's a real world, right? And these are actually pretty easy tracks, so when you're a specialist, it's an amazing skill and shows incredible body of work. So what led you up to that? Did you, growing up like in California, did you, come from a family of, was outside a lot and emphasized naturalist skills, or how'd you get into it?
Yeah, great. So I grew up in coastal Northern California, the Redwood Coastal Mountains mainly, and we moved around some, but that general area, Western Sonoma, Southern Mendocino counties. And since I was a very young child, all I wanted to do was to be a hunter, to be I fantasized about hunting, and I read a lot about wildlife and animals, and I had all these books on Africa as a kid. That's how I spent my time. And when I was 13 years old, my parents moved us to a super rural place on one of the salmon and steelhead running rivers up there on the North Coast. And they ran a YMCA summer camp.
Oh, wow.
And so here we were, plopped in the middle of 500 acres, surrounded by logging company land, really hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of open land. And right out my back door, I had wild pigs. And it was like dropping into heaven for me. We had moved from a town out here to this rural place where there was tons of wildlife. Right out my back door, we went down and I tried fishing the first day, and I landed like this 36-inch, 15-pound just chrome steelhead, and I was hooked.
Wow.
The fish was hooked, but I was hooked as well, and thus began. Well, I'll back up just a little bit. I also had a mentor when I was younger who took me hunting, squirrel hunting and deer hunting, and so I had some background already. But at this point, when we moved up there into the woods, yeah, that was it. That was all that I did, and I spent all my time on the river, spent all my time up in the hills. I got a dog, that palled around with me, and we chased pigs around and deer, and yeah, it was on some level pretty idyllic as far as my perspective goes. It was paradise on earth, and I quickly became a hog hunter, like a serious hog hunter, and I say that with a bit of a smile because I was obsessed. And I hunted.
We need you to move. We need you to move down to Texas.
Yeah, right.
We're overrun with these guys.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah, I hear a lot about the Texas hog problem. Yeah, which could be another podcast. I have perspectives about that too.
I would love to hear that. I'll pencil that in.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I that was what I lived and breathed: hunting and fishing, mainly hog hunting. And I'd kill in high school. I was killing 50, 60 hogs a year, just all the time. I didn't play sports. I didn't do a whole lot of extracurricular activities because I wanted to be home and hunting and playing in the woods. So yeah, it was the kind of upbringing I think that a lot of kids don't get the opportunity to have these days. My parents were really cool in that they gave me all the freedom that I needed. They bought me guns and said, go out and play. And I did. And one thing that I did early on was I found mentors. I found older men in the area who had grown up there, and hunted hogs all these years and knew all the places and had grown up out on these old homesteads that I now hunted on. And so I picked certain mentors in the community to spend time with and learn from. And it was pretty cool. There was one guy in particular whose father was a sheep rancher, and he would send me out looking for things on the landscape. Like up there in the mountains, there's all these old homesteads, and the cabins are mostly all gone, but there's fruit trees and there's springs and there's things you can find. And so he would send me looking for this old cabin or that old truck that had been driven off the bank, in the 50s. And so that sort of gave me this mission to go out, and I would grab my dog and my gun and we'd go out looking for this old split maker's cabin, for instance, and in the meantime we'd hunt and these old Italian men who started me off real young picking wild mushrooms. They call them the porcini and the which are known as the boletes and the cream tops or the cocoras and the chanterelles and all these. Anyway, so at a young age, I was mentored in natural living, hunting, gathering by a number of folks, and as well as some of the local native Pomo people who are long dead now, but they were dear friends and mentors of mine as well. So that's sort of how I got into all this. And I knew of tracking, but I hunted with a dog. So I didn't really need to be a tracker per se. And then one time, one of these mentors and I was out, and we were hunting and we looked at this pig track, and he showed me in this pig track, there was a crack, like in the edge of the hoof. There was a crack and a clear line that you could see repeated. And he pointed that out and he said, this hog you can recognize by its track. And that just really kind of blew my mind. I got to thinking about identifying individuals and what that might mean, and then and that was sort of one of my first big tracking sort of doorways, I suppose. Years go by, and I was a hunter, and I went in the military, and I hitchhiked around the country. I did all this sort of coming of age kind of things. And I wound up out in Wisconsin at the Teaching Drum Outdoor School, which is a school where you can go live a full year immersion, building your own huts, making buckskin clothing, gathering a percentage of your food. And so I joined into that year-long program. And to me, it was sort of like coming back to that aspect of my childhood that I had kind of walked away from in the confusion and anger of my young adulthood, say, and all of a sudden, here I was on the landscape again, just immersed in nature, and so then I had also found about the Tom Brown lineage and the John Young stuff and these other schools, and I had bounced around and went to some of them as well, and taken tracking courses with the Border Patrol guys, and I had sort of touched into all these things, and none of them really captured me. So in the meantime, I'm in Wisconsin. I've been living out in the woods a lot. And my buddy comes to me and says, hey, the International Society of Professional Trackers is going to have a conference here in Wisconsin this year. And there's going to be one of these cyber tracker evaluations. And it's the first I had heard of it. And at this point, I was a little bit frustrated because my teachers couldn't help me get past this wall where I was stuck. I'm not a big book learning type. And so for me to go to the books and sort out whose tracks I'm looking at by measuring and all this stuff wasn't going to work well for me. It didn't. And I didn't want to go be evaluated. I didn't really know what that meant. But my buddy talked me into it. And we went, and it was in 2010, I think. And the evaluator was George Leoniak and Adrian Lowe from South Africa. And all of a sudden, I had found the key for me in my life. I had found someone who could point out tracks and tell me why this is a red squirrel versus a gray squirrel, exactly why. And they could, and my tracking doors just blew back open. At which point I became obsessed again, right? Not with hog hunting this time, but with tracking. And I spent a lot of time out, like on an ice covered lake when there's this much snow on top of it. Anything that walks across that leaves very clear prints, and lots of them. And so my buddy and Abel, we'd get out on this, and Tim would get out on these lakes and mark in the snow. Okay, we think this is a front, and this is a hind, and this is a. And we just spent hours and hours and hours and days and months doing this, figuring out, learning gaits, learning to be able to recognize a trotting gait or a loping or galloping gait at a glance. And, sort of burning those patterned images into our consciousness. And actually after that first eval that I took with George and Adrian, I remember thinking, I want to do what he does. That's what I want to do. He had affected me so deeply and helped grow my understanding so much in 2 days that I wanted to have that effect in the world. I wanted to be able to gift that to others, and really I was going after a specialist certificate in track and sign, not with the at that point, not with the intent of being an evaluator, actually. I just wanted to get that certificate. And I took a couple of evals and my score, because of all this intensive study, my first eval compared to my next, I think I got a 71 or a 73 or 71 on my first eval, a level 1 certificate. And on my second eval, I got like a 95 or something. My learning curve had just climbed up. And I think that's partially because of my hunting and my natural background that I sort of had a leg up as far as
I had a very similar experience. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, cool. And then I just sort of started seeking out evaluations and evaluators, and I bumped into Mark Elbrock, and I found out that he was running a mountain lion project, and I said, hey, I want to come work for you, and he hired me, and so I went out to Colorado, and I lived with him and Casey McFarland and Neil White, and and we hunted mountain lions and put GPS collars on them, and so I got to help out and doing some really cool work, kill site research, right? So I'd hike into kill sites, GPS clusters, and record all the tracks and signs of any other species that were coming and going from that kill, all this cool stuff. And and then after living with them for quite a while, I went and took another specialist eval, and I got a specialist certificate. And then I 2 weeks later, I went to another part of the country and got a second specialist certificate. So I got 2 in like 2 weeks. And and that's when Mark approached me and said, hey, I want you to think about becoming an evaluator. And so that sort of started that whole process of my training. I don't come from a teaching background, so I didn't feel ready at the time to be an evaluator. The evaluators are all quite masterful instructors. They're good teachers, and I didn't have that baseline. So what I started doing is just going and volunteering with the different evaluators all over the place, and I think I volunteered at like 15 evals or something before I kind of felt like I maybe was ready to run my own. And then I did, and that's what I'm doing now. Yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. We could talk for hours just about all the tangents of that.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there. And well, one of my first thoughts is, man, I joined the wrong YMCA as a kid. I wanted the version you got. No, not running them down, but that's incredible. And yeah, what a gift your parents did, whether they do it or not. But it's interesting, and maybe at some point do a series on this, but so many people have, it's never exactly the same, but who really get into this have some sort of background like that, something formational when they were young, parents did, or it may not be in tracking, but there's some sort of usually natural history component that kind of got the bug in them. And, it's just amazing. And full credit to you of doing all that work. And, again, I know, what that's about. And, the path you have to travel to get there. And, it's obviously kind of a shame that we're losing this in our culture, and the way kids are growing up now. But, there's always still a few out there. And so, yeah, what an amazing story. And, just how you got to where you are. So the next question I guess I have for you is, you obviously just enjoy this, you love it. But for someone else, maybe doesn't know much about it, or, is thinking about getting into it, why do you think tracking is an important skill? And beyond that, because what I've seen is that people who start doing it, and maybe they are learning for work, or, field biologists, what have you, but it also ends up being almost like an addiction, or can be, in a good way. It's fun, and maybe fun's the wrong word, but it's just something that resonates. And why do you think that is? And just the overall value.
Great. Yeah, my simple answer, and there's layers to this, I think, but my simple answer is that tracking on some level is fundamental to being human. I don't see that being human and being a tracker necessarily can be separate. I think that there's multiple levels of that, like I say, but if you think about going online and looking for a book, right? We have these tools like Google or whatever that we can use to help us hunt something down, to find something that we're after. You know, children love an Easter egg hunt. People in our culture love to go shopping, right? We're seeking something out to serve a need. And I think partly it's important because we're getting that need met, you know, whether it's hunting for meat for our children or an Easter egg or whatever, you know. Yeah, we're satisfying this need, but to me, there's a connection there that when I'm out on the trail of an animal, whether or not I have the intent of taking its life, and I know that we're not talking about hunting here, but tracking and hunting and humanness are all connected to me. But if I'm hunting this animal down, say it's a bear, and I want to get a picture of it, I'm doing the activity that my ancestors have done for what, hundreds of thousands of years, right? I'm seeking to find this creature on its terms, on equal terms in the woods. And I'm using whatever skills I can, be it my smell, you know, my sense of smell, my hearing. I might hear some brush crack ahead, or my ability to recognize signs and symbols on the landscape that can help steer me, you know, this feedback from the landscape that's steering me towards this animal. So there's two parts to what I say in there, and I want to summarize. One is, yeah, I'm meeting some need in the now, and another is I'm connecting to the means and ends of humanness on some level, the animal humanness of who we are. We forget in our lives these days that we're animals too, right? We're just like a red squirrel. I have 5 digits on my hand, and I take nutrient in and I defecate, just like all the rest of the animals out here on the landscape. So, to me, just on a sort of a quote unquote spiritual sense, it's just connecting to who we are.
Yeah, it's in our DNA, isn't it? I like to tell my students that.
I believe so. Yeah. It as well, like the fun aspect that you mentioned, the detective. To me, it's detective work, right? It's investigative. It's it cultivates curiosity and interest and a deeper view into your surroundings. Yeah, it's a lot of fun for me. You know, getting on the trail of an animal. It's not to get all spiritual, but I feel a connection. I feel a draw. Sometimes I feel drawn down a trail that by something greater than myself. You know, and maybe I'm reading into that or something, and maybe that's just my own excitement. But it doesn't really matter to me, right? It's I'm still experiencing this feeling that quite probably my ancestors all felt in their lives.
You remind me of a program I ran in Belize, a Belizean forest ranger in broken English, you know, was saying, he actually said this on camera. He said, it's like I'm touching the animal. You know, it's like when I go through his tracks, you know, and passing through. And so it is in a way. I like the way that you described that. It's really true. And so there's a lot of people who feel that way.
I love his perspective. And to me, it's, I'm gonna just say that my views tend towards the hippie a little bit. All right. And folks listening, gonna have to deal with that. So to me, it's kind of all about relationship. I have relationship with the land that I live on, right? If you're hunting and gathering, or just gathering, you're literally taking the nutrient, or farming, right? You're taking the nutrient of the land and turning it into human flesh. And that can be done in multiple ways, right? One way is to extract oil from the earth and make fertilizer, oil-based fertilizer, and turn that into human flesh. Another is to do it like people have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, and have that direct relationship with place. So yeah, your friend in Belize, when I'm trailing an animal, I literally feel like I'm in direct relationship. It's a direct connection somehow. And sometimes, like my working out a trail, I'm that animal's behavior is influencing my life. And oftentimes I'll spook that animal and it'll run off, and I'm influencing its life, and we're interacting literally in the way that I see the world.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way of stating that. And I mention this sometimes. I think I have in a couple other podcasts, but if you ever heard the story of Klaus Zuberbuehler, who's an anthropologist and spent years in the Ivory Coast, and don't want to give the story away, but was interpreting these monkey calls and leopard calls. And then he has this epiphany moment when he starts to understand and, having this relationship, and he realizes he's part of the story, right? Always has been part of the story. And there's a very key moment, crescendo, where he realizes that something happens. But yeah, in that sense, we're all hippies, right? I mean, because we all, are dependent on this stuff, even if you're several levels removed. It all goes back to that. We all need sustenance, and, it all starts there. Let me ask you this, Matt. I think that was a beautiful way of phrasing, what tracking does for people on a personal level. And, and it's just fascinating. You learn so much out there. What about, if you're a scientist, let's say a biologist, you don't know much, and you obviously, you worked on a cougar, project, and what does it do from that perspective, on a real practical level where, we're trying to, help save an animal, or, find out more about it, to protect certain valuable landscapes, et cetera. How does tracking come into play there?
Yeah, good question. So I would start, I'm in San Diego right now, and I'm working with the San Diego tracking team, and they're a 20-year-old nonprofit, and they do tracking transects all around the county down here. And they're recording data, and this data can be complementary to hard science, right? So these people can bring their data to the scientists that are studying wildlife here, and they can say, hey, look, we're seeing bobcats are using this corridor often, right? And so bobcat can get from habitat A through this housing complex over to habitat B based on this corridor of land. And we need to preserve that so that the genetic diversity doesn't get shut off there, right? So just based on a purely simple, practical level, and if we think of permeability of landscape or connectivity of wild spaces, wildlife tracking is immensely important. Now, camera trapping also can give you a lot of good information. GPS collars, for instance, can show you where mountain lions are crossing highways, et cetera. But I'll tell you, I was part of this cougar project up in the North Bay for a while. And And their model was they had these maps in the computer, and they did this random sampling, and the computer told them where to put cameras all over the landscape, right, in these random places. And I looked at some of these camera sites and I thought, you're never going to get a picture of an animal here. This is ridiculous, right? So a tracker could come in with focused intention and find where to place these cameras. So you're going to get a high likelihood of success. And, I've helped some folks do that, and many folks are super adept at doing that themselves, but that's where tracking comes in. You mentioned working with college students, and Lee, I applaud that, because kids coming out of college in some wildlife programs come out of college clueless about wildlife on some level. Yeah. It's unbelievable to me. And they're really cool with the cool statistical programs, and they've got the computer, GIS mapping and modeling system stuff down. But you take them out in the woods, and they have no background. So we joke about in the old
that's
days.
why my professor brought me in. She was like, just saw a dearth of these skills, and it was like horrifying her.
Awesome. I'm so thankful for that. Yeah, that's what we need more of. And in fact, I'm trying to steer evaluations towards wildlife students, and I've had some success, but you know how it is. Colleges don't want to kick any money out towards that. Yeah. And unless it's credited, the kids have no motivation.
We should talk more offline, because I'm working in that direction as well. And I think there's some headway being made, but I totally agreement with you 100%. And, it's backed up by each semester. It's part of their final project. They have to say, what'd you learn? How's this valuable? And I mean, the testimonies are incredible. About, this summer I was interning at, this national park, and I was able to recognize this sign. And, even if they're just leading tourists or something, but a lot of them are game wardens, forensic scientists, like, hey, I was able to, bust this person for poaching, or, so, I mean, it truly is a valuable skill. And I think you sum that up perfectly. And, even with the GPS collar, you may know where it goes, but when it stopped here, whatever, you don't know for sure what it was doing. And tracking answers a lot of those questions, right? As you well know.
Right. Yeah. A GPS collar can't tell you necessarily about someone's motivation, like a cat's motivation. Or for Wyatt, did a straight beeline 10 miles through really good deer habitat to make a kill over here, right? Why? Why didn't it kill any of these deer along the way? But we could see that this thing went straight 10 miles, made a kill. And we don't know anything about the whys of that. So anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. And that's a good illustration of, obviously, technology is not going away. It can be very useful. They go hand in hand. It's not necessarily, one or the other, right? I mean, even if we do in some cases like to, harken back to an earlier time, that's not going to happen. And so, but they can still be very valuable. Oh, I do see this cat. Well, let's pick up its trail, and find out what it was doing. Why did it do that?
Right. So a little story I'll share just from a couple of days ago about just that. I was scouting for a tracking class down here in San Diego County at the Santa Isabel Nature Preserve up here. And the ranger, his name was Doug, he took me out and was showing me some cool places where I might find some tracks or whatever. And it's largely sort of, it's like between 4,000 and 5,000 feet elevation, and it's sort of rolling oaks, and it's pretty hot and dry in the summertime. But there's these, and it's grassy, there's these corridors of trees wherever there's water. And so he goes, well, let's hike over to that creek over there, and I'll show you there's some sand, you might see some footprints there that you could use in your workshop. And we went over there, and immediately we spotted the trail of a big male mountain lion running. And so that may or may not mean anything to somebody, but But the first thing that I thought of was, hey, this cat might be running from us.
Yeah.
Right. Because I've kicked up lots of animals. And when I'm in the woods and I notice an animal's gait change, right? A mountain lion doesn't run unless it's running from something or it's chasing something. They don't just run across the landscape. They sneak at a baseline walk, really. That's how they move. And so whenever I see tracks of a lion, for instance, in a running gait, I immediately go, okay, something's happening. Doug and I got to looking around the ranger, and we found where the cat had come walking up the ditch, and we were coming perpendicular towards the ditch, right? And so the cat climbed up on the bank and looked directly at from where we were coming, and then bounded off. And there's ways, there's things that you look for, right? If this cat was running to chase a deer, for instance, its toes would be dug in deep and the claws would show. And while this cat was running, it wasn't digging real hard. It was just getting out of there quietly. So right off the bat, we were able to say, hey, we just bumped into a mountain lion. We didn't see it, but we just pushed this thing out of here, And so we followed him down the creek a ways, and he ran for a little ways, and then went back into a sneaky posture or whatever. Anyway, from a practical sense, as a mountain lion researcher, that's a lot of information, right? I know this cat's a male.
Yeah.
We know that it's right here. We know this is fresh, et cetera, and so forth. And so much quote unquote scientific information can be gleaned that way, just from a familiarity with tracks and sign and patterns on the landscape. That's all.
You just we were talking about gaits there, which is very interesting. And again, I think one of the things with tracking is that people are new to it. They just think of it in terms of identification, species. And when I'm teaching bird language, kind of similar thing. People have done birding before, I'm not saying it's bad, but they're oriented more towards that, or a specific, behavior, that individual bird. But really with, tracking, it's so much more than that. And, gaits tell you exactly, as you just beautifully illustrated, about what an animal could be doing and, why it's doing that. What about some other aspects of it that, you have to look at when, you're out tracking? So for example, aging tracks, or, sometimes we refer to the 5 W's, the what, why, where, when, who, obviously. Can you just talk about a little bit some of the other aspects that you learn or you want to tune into when you are tracking, that you're trying to, as you said, glean from the situation?
You bet. Yeah. I like the questions, the you called them the other day, the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why. And yeah. Let me just step back for a sec on this and make a sort of a metaphor, a parallel. So many folks have heard tracking used as language, right? Learning to track is like learning a language. And for those who have heard that, sorry, but if you haven't heard that, I like the metaphor because to me, it is a language. When I'm learning the alphabet, when I'm learning to sound words out and piece them together, I'm slow, I'm deliberate, and I go, okay, this word is canyon, right? And I'm sounding things out, and I'm sort of, it's slow and painstaking. Now, fast forward 15 years, and I read the word canyon, and it means something to me without having to hardly even look at that. So my fluency has come up, and I now can read whole sentences easily and have an understanding of what was, of the information that was given to me. So tracking is similar, right? It's we're learning the alphabet. We're learning the basics, A, B, C, D. This is a hoofed track. This is a fresh track. This is an old track. This is a soft padded foot. And I know you're going to ask, I know that you're going to ask about learning tracking, but this is a part of that. So when we're learning language, we stumble and stammer and we piece things together. And when we're learning tracking, we stumble and stammer and we try to piece things together, these stories. Now, this is literally the story of this animal's life written on the tapestry of the land, the substrate, right? Substrate could be paper that you're writing on, or it could be the dirt that you're trailing a deer in. So, Lee, help steer me back to your question again now.
No, you're actually covering it just perfectly. Just the different aspects about, there's the 5W questions, but you're not just who, and I love this, by the way, at language, just to interject here, because I use that with bird language, obviously the nature of it, but it's almost like a foreign language that someone was speaking in your house and you never learned, paid attention to. And, if you had a foreign family that was with you and then you learned it in, say, college or whatever, you went back and then all of a sudden they're telling you, hey, mailman came by, dropped a package off, your brother tried to steal your allowance yesterday, someone tried to break in the door. You're just missing all this stuff. And so I love the way you say that, because tracking is like that. It really is a language. It's a story. And so, yeah, I guess the original question was, these different aspects of, it's not just identification, but you want to know, for example, aging, when was this animal there? Right. And, what was it doing? What, and you've already kind of touched on these, but it just seems, to me, obviously I'm out there, there's so many different aspects, of it than just saying, oh, this is a mountain lion track, front right.
Yeah. Yeah. So back to the 5 W's, the who, when, where, why. So when we're learning the alphabet, we're learning the who. We're learning to identify these patterns. It's like seeing a McDonald's emblem. You don't have to think about what that means. It's a symbol and you know what it means. If you're hungry and you see that, your body might have a literal physiological response to seeing that symbol. And so learning to recognize these symbols is really a simplification of just learning track and sign identification. Now, the questions that I really like are the what and why question.
Yeah.
Because to me, that's more of a verb than a noun answer. Right. So it's looking for more of a living answer than a static.
That's the meaning. That's, to me, the contextualization.
Exactly.
It's significant.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's story. Right. Yeah.
And humans work in story. That's how we pass information along. It's how we, what we're doing here right now, we're both just telling stories. And to be able to my friends and I, we joke around about tracking at a glance, because so much of what I've done in the past has been to stare at a track and pick apart all the details and go, oh, look at this claw mark and this metacarpal pad mark, and I like to, so I would consider myself more of a practical tracker than an academic tracker. And neither's good or bad. That's just my style more. So I like to see things and recognize them at a glance and move on. Like I like to move down a trail and follow an animal. And I like to recognize things that I'm seeing along that trail. So the what's and the whys, those are great questions that lead us to actual interpretations of how these animals live on the land. How is it that this black bear can survive out here? what in the world is it eating, right? Well, there's one way to find out, and that's to follow them. Go follow them, and you'll start to recognize. You'll start to say, "Hey, look, these plants have all been bit off right here, right by these black bear tracks." Or, "Hey, look, this yellow jacket nest has been dug up and eaten." Um, oh, hey, so from my experience, I'm learning about the natural history of the bear from seeing these signs that are left behind. So yes, it's literally reading a story, and
What,
yeah, it's a
let
lot
me
of
ask
fun.
you this.
Oh, go ahead.
No, no, if somebody is, again, starting the journey, starting learning, can you talk about the different types of tracking? And what I mean by that is, depending on where you are, your location, the habitat, ecology, but also, time of year, right? Weather, and of course, the substrate, if you're trying to track in hard pan, or, versus a fresh snowfall, that's very different, right? So there's really different buckets. Is that, how do you kind of, again, someone new to it, how would you explain that to people? Or
Yeah, good. This is, again, sort of a layered question. Yes, we can separate these things out in their separate buckets, and that's a great way to learn, and it's a great doorway. And sometimes you might only have the space or the ability to work on one of these buckets at a time, and that's great. I encourage that. Yeah, so and to take it to another level or layer, they're all related. The way that weather works on a track, the way that a tree that fell over 100 years ago and left a hump of dirt, that's a track. That's a story. In some cases, you can see that out in the upper Midwest, where there's these big thunderstorms, you can see that this huge gust of wind came through and blew down a whole forest. And now it's all regrown, but you can still see how all these little mounds of dirt and trenches are in an alignment. So all the trees tipped in the same way. So you can, on some level, look back at a weather event. And that's a super deep layer, right? That might be 50 years ago, but it's a layer that affects what we're seeing right now today, and affects the movement of the animals around these humps of dirt or whatever. Yeah, so we say tracking, and that's a great word. And we separate tracking out, as far as wildlife tracking, into two categories through the cyber tracker tradition anyway. One we call track and sign identification, which is just learning who's who and what's what. Hey, this is a pileated woodpecker sign on a tree, and this is how you identify it. Okay, now when I see that anywhere in North America, I can say, oh, hey, a pileated woodpecker lives here. The other avenue, that's A, and so B would be what we call trailing, and you've mentioned that before. And trailing is literally finding a fresh track. Of course, you could trail an old trail too, but I recommend people find a fresh track and follow the tracks and signs on the landscape to try to see the animal, to find the animal. And it's a lot of fun. Just on a personal note, for me, interacting with large wildlife on the landscape is one of my great joys in life. It's when I'm fully present, fully alive, when I'm 30 feet from a big boar hog that doesn't know that I'm there. It's a powerful experience. Yeah. So if I'm going to follow this animal, the things that you mentioned are important to know about. Like if it rained yesterday and I can see that this track has not been rained in, that gives me a lot of information towards knowing when this animal passed by here, and if there's any hope for me to try to catch up to it. Aging is an aspect of that, what we call aging sign. And I'll just say this, it's a lifelong study. It's always a refinement, and native people who hunt and track every day, who still track every day, like the San people, they're constantly talking and they're constantly adjusting, and they're disagreeing, and they're saying, no, I think it's this, and the other guy's saying, no, I think it's that, and I chuckle about that because when my buddy Preston or Tim and I are out, or Abel are out in the woods, and we're following an animal, we're constantly quote unquote arguing about what's happening. Hey, I think this animal is heading to a feeding area. No, it's heading to a bed. Well, let's find out, right? And so
I love it. I've been on evaluations where that happens, and they start arguing, the evaluator. So it's awesome. But I mean, yeah, it's iterative. That's how you get better. It's how you learn more.
Yeah. It reminds me of a mountain lion and a deer, the relationship that they have, right? So the deer has to be faster than that mountain lion, has to see it coming, has to smell it, has to. Its life and the life of its children depend on it. The mountain lion has to outrun that deer, has to catch it, has to feed its children, right? So it's life or death for both of them. And the Darwinian, the evolutionary sort of natural selection model of the survival of the fittest is kind of neat. It tells a lot about how the mountain lion is continually shaping the deer. The deer are always getting better. They're always getting faster, smarter, better. The mountain lion, the deer, is continually shaping the lion. The lion has to be sneakier, has to come from downwind more, has to be faster, whatever. So they're constantly refining each other, and it's the same for us in our practice of tracking. And when we're out with each other and we're arguing about a track, we're refining. We're making ourselves better. We're learning together, and if we have some humility around it, and keep our egos out of it, and just stay open to what we see, and not get too locked up here, right? It'll work itself out, and we'll learn and grow.
Yeah, that's competitors, and true competitors, like in sports, will say that, someone else, it really seems like, oh, they made me better at what I do, and I love hearing that, the way you phrase that. And I was thinking too, in terms of, trying to figure all this stuff out, not that you ever figure it all out, but you really have to do it in different conditions, different times of years, to really understand the animal, because they do different things, different times of years. Or a couple of years ago, we had which we almost never get down here, blizzard, like 1 in 100 years, and we had a deep freeze. I mean, it was like Wisconsin weather down here for about 10 days, close to zero at night. And anyway, it snowed twice, pretty good snows. And man, I was out tracking, and I felt like, well, I know the area, and a lot of animals. I was just blown away by how many animals were out there. And I knew the species. I mean, it wasn't surprising, but just the number of tracks and trails, and so it was a real eye opener. And it's like, well, just because you've been doing it in one spot, and one time a year, whatever, if you get different conditions, man, you can learn so many things that you didn't know, and I saw these like coyote trails, and I started trying to interpret what they were doing, and then I could tell one was courting a female, and, lying down, the tail swoosh, all this stuff. Right. And so, and that kind of segues into another thing, which, maybe people are listening or going to think this. How do you advise someone, again, that's new to this? It's fantastic. Like you said, it's a lifelong pursuit, but it's easy to get overwhelmed, right? Given, just the number of species, but then, difficult level. Again, my students will say, hey, I'm struggling some of the quizzes. I can't recognize the tracks, not to mention all these other aspects of it that you really done, good job of outlining for people. You have any advice on that? And then along with that, you don't want to get overwhelmed, but what are the keys to becoming proficient so you do become better?
Great. Yeah, good questions. So just sort of to stick with my my pattern of using metaphor, I'll say that if you want to learn the guitar, you're going to start practicing. And if you start practicing 10 minutes a day, you're going to learn, and you're going to advance, and your fingers will start to get less clunky, and you'll make progress. And if I knew a guy who all through high school in his summers, he would play the guitar for 10 hours a day, every day, the whole summer. And the guy's, obviously a masterful musician at this point. So on some level, it's as simple as the harder you work, the luckier you get, right? The more time you put into something, the better you're going to get at it. Now, not everyone can drop everything in life and go out and just train tracking all the time. And many people wouldn't want to do that. So it really varies from lifestyle to lifestyle. If you live in the middle of Los Angeles, it's going to be more difficult for you to learn tracking. Although there are some really cool online workshops, including I saw yours. I haven't seen your material, but I see that you're doing some online stuff. There's another guy down here in the Southwest doing the same thing, Bob, and that's a great way to learn. And actually, I've been evaluating some of Bob's students, and they're pretty good. They come out of this online training, and they are pretty darn good out in the field. It's amazing. It works. So there's many ways to do it. Some folks measure, okay, this bird track is 1 inch and 5/16, and that's how they learn, and and it's great. There's teachers who say to do it that way. There's teachers who say, "Oh, never measure anything." I'm not a measuring type. I see a robin track and I go, "Oh, that's about the size of a robin track," right? I have an eye for size on the ground and in the woods and stuff. And whatever way works for you, whatever combination of ways. And I will say, when you're learning, it's great to find a teacher. It's great to find someone who can just help, for one thing, show you what's really possible. There's a lot of myths out there in the tracking world, and I like to try to dispel some of those, right? Tracking, let's take the mystical out of it. Let's just think of it as purely mechanical. You see a deer track, and then you see the next deer track, and you see the next deer track, and then you move on and you see the next deer track, and it's sort of a mechanical process, right? It can be like that. And with fluency, you might see some deer tracks and just have a internal gut feeling that, hey, the deer's probably heading over there, and go over there and find out. So there's a lot of variance there, but
I like that a lot. Just interject, because I enforce in my class the university students. It's a very rigorous thing, and I don't do a whole lot about size either, because I want them on morphology, to get that pattern recognition, but then I go through an exercise every module, and it's like, okay, I want you to analyze this and and you're familiar with this course, but primary and secondary perception. What do you see? Describe it. Shape. What's there? Toes. Are there nails there? Spacing, negative space, all these things, right? Shape of the pad, etc. And then after you get all that, then use your intuitive faculties, or our own built-in AI, which is really silly because we all have AI, if you want to call it that. It's like, okay, well, what does that look like? And based on, well, it has 4 toes, what has 4 toes, et cetera, had nails, no nails, whatever. And so I love that approach, because I think that's a really good, like you said, some people are just naturally intuitive or more so, but that's always a great default to go back to, and then if you get the fluency, and you just know what a coyote track is. You go, yeah, I know it's a coyote track, you know. But for most people, that takes a while to get to that level.
You bet. And learning the morphology is a great way to get there. You bet. Yeah. Uh, yeah.
How would you tell people, we were talking about, not getting overwhelmed, and I'm just reminded of the slogan, which is very apt. I think in this particular case, I think a coach said this, but they were asking, how do you keep going, or you don't get overwhelmed or whatever. And I think this absolutely applies to tracking. It's like he said, it's not about the capture, it's about the chase. And I think in tracking, same thing. It's not about, or if you in an eval or something, whether you got right or wrong or missed it. It's about, what did you learn that day? Did you process as much as you could and put it in, and now are you better than you were beforehand? And that to me, that's a good motivator to do your whatever 10 minutes a day or whatever you can do, once a week or whatever, so that you don't kind of go, oh, I'll never get this kind of thing. And, we've all, at least I've had that. And I'm sure you probably went through some stages like that at some point, frustration. But I like the way that you verse that about just, regularly getting out there.
A regular practice is amazing. Yeah. Yeah. I would highly recommend it. Find a teacher. If you can, go take do a little research and go take a workshop. It's great to see what's possible. It's great to know what's realistic. One of the best things that I could recommend, I think, right off the bat, is to keep a curious mind, keep an open mind. Part of learning tracking is a personal process as well. We learn how we perceive the world. We learn about how we figure things out and about our own internal dialogue. And one thing I see people do is they get hung up on something and then they're stuck. No, I think this is what it is. And they literally can stop seeing evidence. They can get stuck in their own interpersonal emotional life, be it trauma, memory, whatever, and get stuck. And then all of a sudden are not able to see anymore. They're not able to take in any more information. And I really try to encourage people to keep an openness. Learn to say, hey, I don't know. This is what I'm seeing. And I can't figure it out right now with the book that I have or with the tools in my toolbox. But I recognize this. I see it. I look at it. I'm curious about it. And then the next time I see it, maybe there will be more. Or maybe I'll be in a conversation with somebody talking about some animal and I'll say, hey, that sounds like what I saw that time. So asking these questions, staying open, and just not being too hard on ourselves. Just that's what I would recommend for folks.
That's happened to me several times on evaluations. I know exactly what you're talking about, getting fixated on something, and it just becomes like a mental block, and you have to force yourself, step back, and it can be really challenging to do that. It's funny how the human brain works in that regard.
Yeah. You mentioned the evals several times, and I don't know if listeners.
No, actually, could you go into that? Talk about, or both. In your case, taking a workshop from you or evaluation, and can you speak to how that works, and also just the learning value that you can get out of that, in addition to certification level?
Yes, yeah, you bet. So the organization that I work with is called Cyber Tracker, and it's sort of on some level, it's sort of a marriage of ancient and modern, right? It's the founder of the outfit from South Africa, Louis Liebenberg. He created this software that could go into a handheld device, and it's all icon driven, so that illiterate people can gather data. People who are masterful in the landscape and have long running relationships with the wildlife and the land can actually gather data and contribute to science. And in that way, maintain a traditional life way and yet make a living in our modern world. So what happened was Louis showed up with some of the software, and people say, hey, I'm a tracker, right? Pay me. And so Louis had to design and develop this system of evaluating people's tracking skill. And the idea being, he takes a group of people out in the woods, and he'll show them tracks and sign. He'll circle a kudu track in the sand and ask each person, what is this? And some of them will come up and say, it's a hippo, or some might say it's a lion, and some will say it's a kudu. And so this system of evaluating or assessing someone's skill level, it winds up being sort of a test. You're being tested. We're testing your literacy, your tracking literacy. So the way that happens is like me as an evaluator in North America. I'll take a group of people and I'll circle a track in the sand, and I'll say whose track was this, and say it's a raccoon. Each person will give me their answer, and some people won't have any idea. They won't have ever seen one, and they'll be, it's pretty hard to if you don't have a search image already or know which animals are on the landscape. It's sometimes really hard to imagine who left this print, especially when you start getting down into small little weird animals, right? And so we'll do a string of 3 or 5 questions, and I'll ask each person, what is this? What is this animal doing? Or when did it come by here? Or which foot is this? And I like to say that for those of us who are biologists and working in the field, we like to train at a higher level than we have to perform at in our jobs. So these evaluations can ask a lot of stuff that people might say, what's the point? Who cares the difference between a vole and a mouse track, right? Only a vole researcher would need to know that. But what we're learning is that if we take people across the board with a super broad base of knowledge as a starting point, that their literacy goes way up fast. Now, if we're talking about the difference between two tracks that are this big, and we're looking at the morphological features and the gait patterns of how these animals move, then when we start to look at animals the size of a coyote, right, it'll be a whole lot more easy to see this subtle sign, the little differences here and there. So we'll look at a string of tracks, and then we'll go back to each track as a group, and I'll say, so what is this? What is, whose track is this? And we'll have a discussion about it. And then I will share with the group what it is that I see and why this is a raccoon track. And we'll look at all the different morphological features in the track. And we might throw in some, notice how the animal's moving. A raccoon is the only animal that moves in this particular gait. So just at a glance, seeing the gait, right? So we have it winds up being a heck of a learning experience in a workshop. And before we walk away from that raccoon track, we all agree that we can see what it is that we're talking about. And then we move on. And we do that for 2 days straight. And it is intensive. As you know, it's looking at tracks all day, and I remember in the early days when I was being evaluated, I'd go to bed at night and I'd close my eyes and I would see track images in my mind's eye because I'd been focusing all day on it. So we'll do this for 2 days. We'll keep track of what you got right, what you missed, and then I'll crunch it all into some numbers, and we certify people at different levels. We have what we call level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the scoring system is kind of complex, but I'll give you a brief analogy of how this works. So we ask 3 different levels of questions. Levels being easy, more difficult to extremely difficult. And we have a formula for that. So if I'm asking the track of a large animal that is clear and that there is no other species in the area that I could misidentify it for, then we would call that a 1-point question. Now, if I add a bit of obscurity, or if maybe the rain had beat the definition out of the track, or the animal had turned and smudged its foot somehow, then that increases the difficulty level to a 2-point question. And then, if you go into like small animals or more layers of obscurity or other animals that could be confused with, then we bump them up to a 3-point question. And I ask a percentage. I shoot for about 25% 1-point questions, about 50% 2-point questions, and about 25% 3-point questions. And the questions are weighted. So if a person misses a 1-point question, like a clear horse track, which we would call an easy question, if they miss that, that's hard on your score. You'll get 3 points against you. And if you get it right, you only get 1 point towards you. And as we get to the other end of that spectrum, a 3-point question, if you miss it, you only get 1 point against your score. And if you get it right, you get 3 points towards your score, like a difficult track. So the way this algorithm, so to speak, works is that the questions are weighted, and you can miss more hard questions and still do pretty well. You start missing a higher number of easy questions, and that can really hurt your score. But it gives us an accurate cross-section of a person's knowledge of wildlife tracking. It's a rigorous enough system that we can take luck out of the mix, and we can see what people know. And that's all that we're doing. We're the mission of Cyber Tracker originally, in my mind, is basically to locate and recognize expertise in the field. We're looking to find trackers who can be certified at these levels. Well, what we've found is that the certification process itself creates good trackers. The literacy increases at a speed that we don't see in any other ways of tracking, and we speculate as to why that is. And my hunch is that the bit of pressure, the performance anxiety, the me asking you to come up with a story here, somehow helps cement that in people's psyche, and it makes it a potent, memorable process. And it's actually been scientifically studied. Jonah Evans' wife, Ciel, did a study in Texas where they looked at people's tracking ability. They did an evaluation. They looked at and then they did 3 months later, did another evaluation, and their scores all significantly climbed. So just being evaluated increased these people's tracking literacy. And we're seeing that all over the place. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's an amazing learning experience. You spelled that out in a lot greater detail than I think could have said, but I completely agree with you. And then especially once you've done one, if you go back, you know what's kind of expected. And so then there's a pressure of, studying and preparing properly. And again, using the language metaphor, it's like an immersion class. You're throwing everything at everybody, and that's been shown in language. That's by far the best way to learn. Right. And so, yeah, I can't highly enough recommend the evals, and if you can't do that, or, vice versa, a workshop. And also just the usefulness, a lot of people do it just for personal enjoyment or hobby, but from a scientific perspective, it's interesting. I knew that story as well about Lou Liebenberg. And I remember back in the day, I was in a lab and my colleague was programming. It was the Palm Pilots. And they had a little GPS thing. And I remember reading this story. This was before I was tracking. other than knowing a few basic tracks, kid growing up. And I remember hearing that, if I recall correctly, they were doing it for a scientific reason, get census counts on animals in South Africa. And they were getting this data back that was mostly rubbish. They're going in the handhelds. These guys were like, well, it's a kudu track. No, that's a, whatever, Thompson Gazelle, whatever the case was. And so Mr. Liebenberg had to say, no, hold on a second here. And that started the formal process for training. Anyway, hence the name Cyber Tracker, because a lot of people hear that and they're like, so so people are aware of, there's no computers involved when you get out in the field, right? But anyway, well, hey, Matt, this has been awesome, incredible. Appreciate the explanation. If people are interested and want to find more about Cyber Tracker, but also yourself, where they can find you, your own workshops, evals, etc., how can they do that? Can you tell them where to go?
You bet. So evaluations that I run are put on the Collective Tracker Certification website, which is the Cyber Tracker North America website. And the website is trackercertification.com. I have a personal website or two, actually, that you could reach me through. One is called wildwisconsin.org. And the other one is called redwoodcoastanimaltracking.com. And I would say that anybody who's listening to this and who is struggling along their journey to become a tracker, if I can be of service, send me an email. I'd be happy. I typically respond to emails, and my email is nelsonmattw@gmail, and that's NELSONMATTW@gmail.com.
Yeah, and I can personally attest, Matt is a great teacher. He's, even if you get it totally wrong, he's very patient. He won't make you feel like a moron. And he's great at explaining it. Yeah, he's just a wonderful teacher. And I know you said earlier you aren't, but I think you are a really good teacher. And I highly recommend his services and the other Cyber Tracker evaluators. But if you get a chance, take a workshop or an eval from Matt. You're going to learn so much. So, hey, listen, thank you very much for your time. I hope we get to do this again, because I could talk to you for hours more on a variety of subjects, but I really appreciate all your insight.
You're welcome. And thank you as well, Lee. I appreciate the opportunity here to talk. Yeah.